Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. This week, we're going to be talking about non-metallic metal, and I think this model is probably the best example I can use. My Black Templar army uses entirely non-metallic metal, and it's a skill I've been slowly learning over the last 18 months, and now I finally feel ready to attempt High Marshal Helbrecht. For anyone joining us who doesn't know what non-metallic metal is, it's essentially using acrylic paints to create a metallic effect on a model. There are paints that exist with metallic pigments in, and they can be used too, but that's known as true metallic metal, and it relies on those pigments to create the effect. Non-metallic metal is a very laborious process, but the end result always looks amazing, provided it's done right. And hopefully in this video, we'll cover off how we might be able to do that. Before we truly begin, I have to cover off a few details that are going to get in the way later. If I finish doing all my non-metallic metal armour and then go back to paint the cloak, I'm going to get red everywhere. Now we can start on the main course. I'm starting by base coating the entire armour in Rhinox hide. One of the key things about metal in real life is it switches from very dark to very bright very quickly. The highlights are very shiny and the shadows are very dark. So I'm starting with the darkest colour in the same family as gold, brown. Once this first layer is dry, we're going to go on to the next step, and we're going to move up gently through some colours by mixing Mournfang Brown and Rhinox hide in a 50-50 ratio. You have to move slowly up through the colours in order to make a believable blend. You can come back and smooth out any edges with glazing later, but I want to get this right first try if I can. This is by no means a quick painting process, but it is so satisfying when it looks right. As I'm adding this layer, I'm leaving the Rhinox hide in the deepest shadows wherever possible, and only highlighting where light would actually reflect off of the model. If you want to know where to place your highlights, look at 3D objects with light pointing at them, so ball shapes, cylinder shapes, etc. The best way is honestly to have a bright light pointing down from above or from the direction where you want your light to be reflected on the model, and take a picture of it. If you gloss varnish beforehand, you'll get an even truer reflection, but I skip this step. As we move on to the next step, which is pure Mournfang Brown, you can see there's a slight technique I'm using with the brush. By using tiny little sweeps as I make this reflection, I'm trying to add the illusion of texture. Metal is very rarely absolutely smooth, so I'm adding little creases and dimples by doing this. Not only does it add to that faux realism that we're going for, it also makes the effects just that bit easier to create. You don't have to be perfectly smooth all the time. As I'm layering up through these stages, I'm covering a smaller and smaller area, with my previous layer acting as my template, my guidelines. Even at this early stage, essentially step 3 of a multi-step process, I could see it was starting to work, and at the very least I was getting some nice layers. The next step is yet another mix with 50-50 Mournfang Brown and Balor Brown. Once again, using the previous layer as my template. This is the last stage before I go on to what I consider to be the real point highlights. Essentially, this is the last of my real smooth blends before I really look at getting to where that light's going to be most brightly reflecting. Even though at this point it's taken me quite a while to get here, so probably about an hour and a half's worth of work, this is unfortunately all just prepping the surface for the real highlights that are going to make it pop. The most important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is contrast, those dynamics between the dark and light, and it's only when the brightest highlights are added will this truly look like metal. It is, however, a very zen process. I think I had Knives Out on in the background, which is an excellent film, and I was just having a good time adding layers to this model. The hardest part to highlight was actually his helmet, because it's a flat-topped Crusader helm. Normally if it was a regular bowl-shaped helmet or a Primaris-style helmet, it'd be quite easy to highlight because it's quite rounded. But as it's got a flat top, I had to be quite creative with how I was going to highlight it. When it came to the ornament above his power pack, I decided on a specific side that I wanted the light to reflect off of. This meant I created a large highlight in one area and a smaller highlight towards the bottom right, leaving some darkness in between, and I mirrored this on the back. I always find the smaller the surface you have to cover, the harder it is to highlight. This is very spiky, so it's a little bit confusing, but when we add the final highlights, it will look good. Now we're going to use Balor Brown as our first edge highlight. I'm still adding to those bar highlights down the center of the legs or on the shoulder pads, as I was previously, but in a much thinner layer. This is less a blend and more of that sharp contrast I was talking about earlier. I've really thinned down my paint, so I actually needed to do 1 or 2 layers of this just to make sure that it read correctly on the armor and wasn't overpowering all those blends we've done previously. Now I use this paint to give a chunky edge highlight. Now that doesn't mean it's massive, but it means it's enough that my next edge highlight I can do thinner and it looks like there's a slight gradient between them. Unfortunately, whilst I can provide you with the specific colours to use for a nice gold or even part of the technique, I can't teach you brush control. That's something you have to earn through practice. Non-metallic metal, whilst highly desired among miniature painters, unfortunately is not a beginner technique. It's taken me 18 months to even get this far, and there's definitely things I can improve upon. All I'm hoping that you get out of this video is just the building blocks of where to start non-metallic metal and the rough idea and guidelines of where things are meant to go on the model. It's a tough thing to get into, going from a single base coat, a shade, and then a highlight, to instead doing essentially freehand on the center of a large panel. I suppose what I'd say is just don't be afraid to give it a go. Find a model you're fairly excited about, but hopefully not one that's too expensive. I have a Sanguinius from Forge World sitting around that probably needs the same treatment, and I was not starting on him. Even if your first couple of attempts look a little bit dodgy, mine definitely did, you'll learn a lot, and your brush control can only improve. And hey, my dodgy first attempts I was still incredibly proud of, and I hope you will be of yours too. I'm still truly learning how to do non-metallic metal. I was just really proud of this attempt and thought it'd make a good video. Moving on to our penultimate step, we're using Screaming Skull as a final edge highlight. I'm still using that sweeping motion on my final bar highlights down the legs, and that's just to keep that illusion of texture, and also doesn't look really odd with one thin line down the center, whereas everything else has been really nicely blended, especially as this is such a massive jump in contrast. Honestly, I was really happy with the attempts up to this point, and this just completed it. It made it look like actual metal, and I was honestly quite surprised. Again, I'm using my Baylor Brown as my guidelines here. I'm just doing a very thin highlight inside that previous Baylor Brown layer. Now you can go much brighter than this if you want, but if you go too far towards white, or likewise too far towards black, it will stop reading as gold and start blowing out the contrast. In this instance, I was actually quite happy with the tone of the gold I'd created, but if I hadn't been, there are steps I can take to make it read more as a gold I prefer. If you thin down some contrast paint and glaze it all over the miniature, then you can change the hue subtly whilst keeping all that detail you've created. In this situation, I would have probably used Eandon Yellow. That would warm up the gold and stop it looking quite as cold. But again, because I'd left so much brown in the recesses, it still felt quite warm, and so I was happy with it and didn't want to risk glazing over it. Just in case I didn't like it, not because it would ruin it. All the processes I mentioned here can be used in the exact same way for steel, brass, bronze, whatever. You just change your colour set out. For steel, I would generally start with a very dark grey and leave black in the recesses and work all the way up to a just off-white. Steel or silver non-metallic metal is fine with white paint, but generally I don't like to go quite that far because it just looks so stark. Once the Screaming Skull layer is done, I went back in with a few of my older colours just to smooth out a few transitions. I did this in a glaze consistency. If I was really trying to push this model, which frankly I can't imagine because this took ages anyway, I would be using glazes everywhere just to introduce a few colours, the reflections of the red cloak and also the reflections of the glowing lantern he's holding. For my final step, I added a few spots of pale sand just to add a few specular highlights on the brightest upper areas. And with that, the non-metallic metal is complete. I'm going to give you a quick preview of how he's looking, but I'm going to go on to how I did all the skin tones of the orc and his servitors next week. Now, while this video wasn't a complete step-by-step guide as to how to do non-metallic metal, hopefully it's given you a bit of an idea of the phases that you have to go through in order to reach a final result. The main things to take away, honestly, are contrast, brush control, and thin layers. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been Sam. See you next time.